From KVUE News in Austin, you're watching Texas This Week with Ashley Goodo.
Good Sunday morning. Early voting has ended and Super Tuesday is upon us. We're diving into what's on the minds of voters with James Henson, Executive Director of the Texas Politics Project at UT Austin. But first, let's get to the 3 things you need to know in Texas politics. The Texas-Mexico border was prime stumping ground this week. President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump both toured the border, met with personnel, and got briefings on the same day, Thursday. President Biden was in Brownsville while former President Trump headed to Eagle Pass. President Biden says it's time for Congress to pass border legislation to give Border Patrol more resources. He criticized Republicans for preventing a bipartisan border bill from reaching his desk and even called on former President Trump to work with him to get legislation passed. Trump led an effort to block the bill from passing. Meanwhile, former President Trump, who was joined by Governor Greg Abbott, criticized the Biden administration, saying President Biden is responsible for an invasion at the border. A federal judge blocked a controversial Texas border bill that was set to take effect on Tuesday, March 5th. Senate Bill 4 would allow local and state law enforcement to arrest people who they believe crossed into Texas illegally. It would also allow judges to order migrants to be transported to the ports of entry on the southern border, regardless of their country of origin. The state immediately appealed the decision. U.S. Senator John Cornyn from Texas plans to run for Senate Republican leader. U.S. Senator Mitch McConnell announced Wednesday he is stepping down from the position in November. Cornyn has served in the U.S. Senate for more than 20 years. He says he believes he has, quote, built a track record of listening to colleagues and seeking consensus while leading the fight to stop bad policies that are harmful to our nation and the conservative cause, end quote. So far, no other Republicans have announced their candidacy for the role. Last month, the team at the Texas Politics Project at UT Austin polled registered Texas voters to get their thoughts on candidates and issues as we head into the primary elections. This morning, James Henson, Executive Director of the Texas Politics Project, joins us with insights on voter attitudes. You know, let's start first and foremost by talking about voter turnout in this primary election. Thus far, it's been a pretty lackluster.
Yeah, I mean, by most of the recent reports, and we're just looking at early voting so far, but Republican turnout's been just sort of average, kind of weak, but Democratic turnout is way down. And I think there are, pretty obvious, more or less, explanations for that. Some of it is just general. We're in a primary election with no real competition at the top of the ballot. Both of the presidential races are, for all intents and purposes, decided. We know that, barring, various disasters that could befall either of these candidates, we're going to see Joe Biden running for re-election. We're going to see Donald Trump seeking to return to the White House. That takes a lot of interest out of the election, given that other than a Senate primary that's been pretty low key on the Democratic side, everything else is legislative and, down ballot races. Not a lot of interest. And then, if you're looking at the difference between Democrats and Republicans, it's a familiar story. Republicans are spending a ton of money on House races. The technical term, a ton of money, but more than a couple of the previous years combined. Not very much being spent, and not a lot of organization on the Democratic side. There's just not a lot to generate interest and mechanically to drive turnout.
Primaries are very important in Texas because in a lot of these races, the reality is the primary is the election.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so when we look at, say there's going to be 2 million, maybe a little more, maybe a little less in a Republican primary statewide, that means that a little more than 1 million voters decide who's going to be on the ballot in a general election that is by and large non-competitive. And this is where, obviously it's a very political question, but it's hard to deny that, the registration and voting rules in Texas in a lot of ways don't make it convenient to vote. Mm-hmm. And that impacts turnout, and that really does manifest in these primaries where you have, in the end, a very, small number of voters having a big influence on who's going to go to office in these districts that, as you say, are generally non-competitive. Although in this year, we're seeing a little more, we're seeing more competition in the primary, but our expectation is that we're not going to see more than say, in the state House of Representatives more than maybe 5 or 6 very competitive races, no matter what happens in the primary.
What are the races to watch?
Well, we talked about this U.S. Senate race on the Democratic side, and I think that, while Colin Allred is highly favored in that race, in our latest UT Texas Politics Project poll, we had Colin Allred just over 50%. And remember, in a primary race, you need to get over 50% to avoid a runoff. We had him at about 52%, with which is in the margin of error. So, we're watching that race to see what happens, because that Senate race in the fall with Ted Cruz is going to be interesting.
So that's one of the races you're watching. Any others?
Well, I think, there's an overall dynamic going on in the Texas House on the Republican primary, as you well know, that is just preoccupying insiders, where we have, a historic amount of money being poured into these races. And so there's a handful of races in rural and small town areas where you have, literally millions of dollars being poured in to support challengers versus incumbents who either voted against the voucher bill and are being opposed by Governor Abbott and his allies, or voted for the impeachment of Ken Paxton. So, there are interesting races scattered all over that array. Not too many in the Austin, Central Texas area, but several in other outlying exurban areas that everybody is watching. And it's not so much the race is how many incumbents get defeated, and what is the threshold in which the governor, the attorney general, can stand up and claim symbolic victory, and how much will the overall outcome impact the composition of the legislature, which, believe it or not, is going to be back in a new session in less than a year.
Yeah, it's so crazy to think we're going to be back already. And I want to really hone in on that, but that school choice, the school voucher fight. So we know that 5 of those incumbents who voted, they would say to represent their district's interest, and they voted against the vouchers. They retired. So we know that the governor and his fight already picking up 5 seats. That's expected. Those others, if some of those incumbents get reelected, do you think this hurts Governor Abbott's position in Texas? Or do you think voters really aren't paying that much attention to the endorsements in those races?
Well, I think those are 2 related but slightly distinct questions. So on one hand, I think, it's kind of what I was alluding to a minute ago. It's a little unclear how many of these more competitive races the governor needs to win to declare victory. It seems unlikely that they are going to flip enough of those seats to change the voucher vote or the dynamics on school choice when the legislature comes back in January of next year. Mm-hmm. But the interesting thing that you kind of touch on there is that while all of us see this as, and including the governor, I think, see this as a fight over vouchers, most voters don't see it that way. So in the February UT poll that we did, we asked primary voters, what was on their mind in these legislative races. And we gave them an open-ended question, so they could just say whatever popped into their head. And it looked very familiar in the sense that more than 60% of Republicans in these, voting in these House primaries, or say they're potentially voting in these House primaries, said immigration and border security. And only 2% said vouchers or school choice or savings accounts, anything kind of related to that. And, essentially nobody said the Paxton impeachment. Now, that doesn't mean that the fights that are motivated by those issues aren't going to have an impact. Because, just because you are Governor Abbott or you're an ally and you want to defeat somebody on school vouchers, that doesn't mean you're going to try to beat them on that issue. You're just going to try to beat them by attacking them personally, by saying they're weak on border security, by doing whatever you can to get them out. And if the polling that they are doing in those districts tells them that vouchers isn't going to move the needle, well, then they're not going to talk about vouchers.
Early voting has run its course, but you can still cast your ballot on Election Day, March 5th. And that night, join KVUE News for live election results and in-depth analysis as soon as the polls close at 7 p.m. You can watch on KVUE Plus, which is available on Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and Apple TV. We'll also be live on KVUE.com and the KVUE YouTube channel. That's Texas This Week.